And I'm just, just 1 second, please. We're just getting started. Bear with us. While you are waiting, we are preparing to live stream this on the Indivisible Westchester Facebook page. You will find it there shortly. That is what I'm doing right now. And here we go. Okay. Welcome to the Westchester Activist Candidate Forum. And we wanted to begin tonight, before we started, with a few words of perspective. We could not hold this forum without noting that today is a sad day for America, as George Floyd was remembered at his memorial service in Minneapolis. In the spirit of honoring the memory of George Floyd and of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and the many lives wrongly cut short while we work towards a better future, we would like to observe a moment of silence, and we will do that now. Thank you. So good evening. I'm Suzanne Berger, and I welcome you to the Westchester Activist Forum for the Democratic Candidates for Congress in New York's 17th District. This forum is being recorded and is also being live streamed on Indivisible Westchester's public Facebook page. For those who may have difficulty hearing, we encourage you to set your Zoom viewing mode to speaker view. Here are the candidates that you'll be meeting shortly. The 17th District includes most of Rockland County and large parts of North and Central Westchester County. The district is heavily Democratic, with the most votes coming from Westchester. Primary election day is Tuesday, June 23rd. Polls will be open from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Polling places are still to be determined. Early voting runs from Saturday, June 13th through Sunday, June 21st. On Saturday, June 13th through Sunday, June 21st, the hours will be 12 to 5 p.m. The hours are 8 to 4 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and 12 to 8 on Tuesday and Thursday. This year, any voter may vote by absentee ballot. You should have been mailed an application for a ballot, and this must be filled out and returned by mail or email by June 16th. You will then be mailed a ballot, which must be postmarked by June 22nd. If you have not received your ballot or need more information, you can obtain a ballot application at the Westchester Board of Elections site at citizenparticipation.westchestergov.com. The Coalition of Westchester Indivisible and activist groups sponsoring this forum maintain their neutrality and will not endorse any candidate in the primary election. Even though individuals may support one or another of the candidates, the groups remain completely neutral. We are joined tonight by 7 candidates. In alphabetical order, they are David Buchwald, Assemblyman representing White Plains and portions of Northern Westchester; David Carlucci, State Senator representing Rockland County; Asha Castleberry Hernandez, U.S. Army veteran and professor of foreign policy; Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Foreign Affairs Advisor. Allison Fine, former National Chair of NARAL Pro-Choice America Foundation. Mondaire Jones, attorney and former U.S. Department of Justice staffer. Adam Schleifer, former Assistant U.S. Attorney. Our timekeeper tonight is Mariana Stout of Indivisible CD17. Our moderator is John Metaxas. John is an award-winning broadcast journalist for WCBS and Bloomberg Radio, and previously for CNN, CNBC, and Channel 2. John is an attorney and graduate of Columbia Law and Journalism. He is a member of SAG-AFTRA and serves on the union's National Broadcast Steering Committee. He podcasts on Apple and at johnmetaxas.com. John?
Thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Candidate Forum. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to moderate this discussion. We're pleased to have 7 candidates who have done what's vital to our democracy. They've put themselves out there and asked for the opportunity to serve, and we congratulate each of you. Tonight's questions have been formed by a broad discussion among a committee of the organizers with some input from me as well. The clock is really our enemy tonight. Because we want to hear from every candidate on every question, we have to ask the candidates to keep their responses to 1.5 minutes each. Mariana Stout will be our timer and flash a 15-second warning on her screen, and then a stop indicator, as you can see on your screen right now, at the end of the 1.5 minutes. We need the candidates to wrap up and finish when they see that stop signal. Because we have 7 candidates, we're budgeting around 12 minutes for each question and set of answers, and that means we may not get to more than 6 or 7 questions tonight. Remember, this is not a debate, it's a forum, so any candidate that wants to respond to something another candidate says will have to wait until their next answer or their closing statements. But each candidate will get to answer each question, and if everyone follows the rules, everyone will get equal time. The idea here is to inform and educate the voters about the candidate's views. Now, we will not have opening statements, but each candidate will get a 1-minute closing statement. Again, Mariana will be our timekeeper. And the first question will be answered by the candidates in reverse alphabetical order of last name. The second question will begin with the second candidate on that list, and so on. And so the order of candidates for the first question will be Adam Schleifer, Mondaire Jones, Allison Fine, Evelyn Farkas, Asha Castleberry-Hernandez, David Carlucci, and David Buchwald. So it is time now for the first question, and we address this first to Adam Schleifer. America has seen a diminished moral standing in the world after the killing of George Floyd and many other people of color over the years by those entrusted with the public safety. To what extent do you believe structural and systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia are embedded in American institutions, especially the police and police unions, and what specific actions would you take to mitigate such racism?
Yeah, John, thank you for the question, and thank you everyone here for gathering and participating in our democracy in this way. I think it's clear that we have had a 400-year sorrowful history of mistreating African Americans and people of color in this country, and a 250-year history starting from the hypocritical words that Thomas Jefferson uttered, which were so inspiring, but not meant by him when he said it, that all people are created equal. And so I think we now have seen this week and in prior weeks just how far we have to go. I'm proud that when I was a federal prosecutor, I fought for justice alongside my close mentor, Lawrence Middleton, who prosecuted the men who beat Rodney King in Los Angeles in the early 1990s, and that I have striven for justice and for a form of justice that unites all of us in safety, but also in equality. And I think we have so much more to go. And as to your specific question about how to address that, we need implicit bias training as conditioned on federal funds that go to law enforcement units, including at the local level, so that when the federal funds come in to fund law enforcement, we need to ensure that police officers are properly trained. We need to actively use the laws, including the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act, which protects everyone from the victims of anti-Semitic attacks in Muncie to African-American victims of hate crimes. And we need to use the Department of Justice to do what it's supposed to do, hopefully under a new president and an attorney general who are capable of delivering upon the promises of justice and investigating and rooting out the kinds of racial violence and police brutality that we've seen recently. Thank you.
Thank you. The next answer, and any candidate that wants me to repeat a question, I can do that, but I only plan on reading them once for now. The next answer comes from Mondaire Jones.
I appreciate the question. It's been on my mind a lot. I've been talking about it a lot. It's something that is my lived experience, right? As a Black guy in America, of course, I believe, in fact, I know it to be true that there is not just individualized racism in this country, but systemic racism in this country. It's why I've been talking about policing reform, unlike my opponents in this race from the very beginning. You know, we need to enact national standards. You know, we need to have folks who are identifying themselves. We need to repeat and also de-escalating. That should be a requirement. Things like chokeholds should be eliminated as an option even, which is not the case right now in New York City. We can do that through financial incentives and disincentives at the federal level if there are constitutional concerns. We have to repeal so-called qualified immunity that allows people to go scot-free when they've clearly violated the constitutional rights of individuals. But we need to make sure that we are going well beyond that. There are so many structural changes in our criminal justice system that needs to be advocated and successfully implemented, whether that is making sure that we are eliminating mandatory minimums, legalizing cannabis, you name it. But, you know, this is something that Democrats have not been strongest on either. I'll be honest with you. You know, the fact, for example, that there was a legislation in the state legislature to repeal 50A so that people could see the disciplinary records of police officers, and that David Buchwald and Senator Carlucci only signed on to that after nationwide protests, shows you why we need more people in Congress for whom policy is personal. It should not take nationwide protests to show leadership on the issue of racial justice. This is something that is personal for me, and I'm tired of people using racial justice as a political football.
All right, thank you very much. Our next answer is from Allison Fine.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the introduction as chair of NARAL, but my actual area of expertise is I have spent several decades fighting for social justice, supporting grassroots organizations in areas as diverse as environmental justice, racial justice, financial equality in rural Georgia, in East St. Louis, in Oakland, all around the country. I have literally worked with thousands of grassroots groups. Social injustice is baked into our system. We are not broken right now. This is how the system was built. And of course, we need to look at policing and getting police brutality down to zero, and having the Justice Department reinstate the consent decrees that allow it to go and monitor individual police departments for their discretions. However, if we're really going to get to the root causes of systemic racism, it is threaded throughout our entire society. So when you look at housing, there's systemic racism there in where and how affordable housing is created, and in public schools and in healthcare. And we need leaders who understand how to look at the systemic impact of these issues and how to bend the curve differently. And I've done that my entire career.
Thank you. We now hear from Evelyn Farkas. Dr. Farkas.
Sorry. Thank you for the question, John. Clearly, slavery and racism, the legacy of slavery and racism are pervasive, are systemic, and need to be reversed. I actually took an opportunity as a national security person to draw attention to this a couple of years ago, when I realized that oftentimes things can start with the Department of Defense budget and with the national security community that are good for society writ large. We can get some kind of consensus from people who are not normally involved in this issue. And I wrote an op-ed calling for the passage of a piece of legislation that used to be authored by John Conyers, now Sheila Jackson Lee, that calls for a commission to look at the legacy of slavery and racism and make recommendations. But that, of course, is very insufficient. But it's a start, because it does then start to educate more and more Americans. We do see on the streets more Americans have been educated, have awakened to the reality for Black Americans in America today. But we need to do more educating. We need to lay out more facts so that we can pass more legislation. But at the same time, we need to pass legislation now. And some of that legislation involves, first of all, getting police reform, criminal reform. I put out something on Monday on my website that looks at what we need to do. I already had things on criminal justice, but on police reform, getting rid of qualified immunity, making sure that the Department of Justice is mandated to examine and to prosecute cases that involve excessive police force. We need to also make sure that we end mass incarceration, private prisons. And then across the board, as Allison, I believe, mentioned, or Asha, we need to look at housing. We need to look at all the aspects, education, where inequality is baked into the cake.
Thank you very much. We now hear from Asha Castleberry Hernandez. And just a quick reminder, your mic is muted.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much for this question. As you know, right now in American history, this is such an emotional moment, especially for a Black woman like me. You know, I disagree with Mondaire Jones that he's the only one that came out with a criminal justice plan. That I also as well. You know, my first thing that came out when I jumped this race is addressing mass incarceration. Why that is also personal for me, because I've had family members impacted from that. So I want to set the record straight for there. I do agree with Evelyn and most of us here that systemic racism is a problem. And in fact, you know, when we look at the criminal justice reform or looking at policing, of course, we should support programs in addressing racial bias, call on periodic mental evals when it comes to police officers, call on the national standard, which came out from Senator Kamala Harris, as well as, you know, de-escalation tactics, which I know for as a professional in uniform that rules of engagements, when they don't work, you have to change them. So we have to look at changing those standards, and that's really important. And also I agree on the fact that we have to get rid of private prisons as well. And another point too, I want to mention as far as systemic racism, how can we really address it? Well, when you look at an institution, if systemic racism is baked into that institution and that institution refuses to change, then we should have people of color, more people of color, you know, building up their own institutions and being able to combat that racism. So if institutions clearly refuse to modify or change their behavior, then they should build their own. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We now go to David Carlucci.
Thank you, John, for moderating, and I want to thank the candidates for all being here and the coordinators of this debate tonight. I just came from a protest in Spring Valley where we had hundreds of people, and it was a beautiful sight, a peaceful protest demonstrating and getting out the frustration and anger and demonstrating in a peaceful way about change. I'm hopeful that we don't have to wait till Congress in the New York State Legislature. I'm hopeful that this next week we'll be passing meaningful reform. That's why I'm a co-sponsor of the repeal of 50A, that I'm a co-sponsor on banning chokeholds. And these things need to be national. I've been a leader pushing for the crisis intervention teams in the New York State because yes, racism is systemic. It's pervasive in all aspects of society, and we have to work to make sure that we have changes. Crisis intervention teams are so essential, and now we just have them in a few police departments across the state of New York. We need to have it in every corner of the state and every corner of this nation to make sure that we're de-escalating situations. But it starts in our schools and our education system. One of the pieces of legislation that I support on the state level and the federal level is the Never Forget Act, to teach our children at an early age-appropriate curriculum about what is a noose, what is a swastika, so that the first time that our children learn about it is not from graffiti scrawled somewhere or from some hate website. We have to be proactive.
Thank you very much. And now David Buchwald.
Thank you very much for this truly important question. And it's so important that I think that personal attacks should be actually accurate. It was 4 years ago in 2016 that I voted to reform the 50A law here in New York. That's on the record. And I'm hopeful that next week, as a co-sponsor of the 50A repeal bill, that we indeed repeal 50A. That's the law that shields police from accountability for their misconduct here in New York State. But more broadly, at the federal level, we should be combating systemic racism. First, in the criminal justice system, doing things like ending mandatory minimums, ending the practice of private jails in the prison industrial complex, but far more. And indeed, it's systemic racism in many other areas. In housing, we still have discrimination. I carry 2 bills in the state assembly on behalf of the Division of Human Rights to combat housing discrimination specifically. We also have issues when it comes to our education system, lack of equity and resources, and also in our tax code. And I'm a tax lawyer, and I know that we have a tax system that perpetuates wealth, and that wealth was not always based on individual accomplishment. It was often based on a frankly racist system that our country was founded on.
Thank you very much. Our second question was actually supposed to have been our first question, but because of events, we shifted the order a little bit. So this question is posed first to Mondaire Jones. What are the top 3 issues that you would work on if you are elected to Congress? What action would you take for each? And what in your background qualifies you to work on those issues?
Goodness. All right. I may have to ask you to repeat that 3-part question. Let me start by saying that immediate cash assistance for families has to be the #1 priority right now. You know, I've said repeatedly that the environment has to be centered, but I understand that people are trying to figure out how to put food on the tables for themselves and for their family members and pay rent or mortgage. And so they don't want to hear so much right now about the environment to them as they try to figure out how to survive in the moment. But the environment continues to be a top priority for me. And so as we pass legislation that comes out of Congress, we have to be doing things like investing in green infrastructure projects. Here's a real opportunity to do it as we look at the silver linings. We've seen over 40 million people over the past 10 weeks alone lose their employment. Millions of those jobs will not just reappear even after COVID is over. And so we have to make sure that we are using this as an opportunity to create jobs. You know, we know that a federal jobs program is one feature of the Green New Deal, which currently is a resolution. I understand that. But we can be doing that as we are passing iteratively legislation coming out of Washington. And the third thing has to be addressing the healthcare crisis. I'm proud, once again, to be the only candidate supporting Medicare for all, the only policy that would literally ensure everybody, as we think about those 40 million people who lost their health insurance over the past 10 weeks alone. This is a system where largely healthcare is provided by your employer. And so we have to make sure that those people are being taken care of. Nothing like a global contagion to drive home the point that even if you don't have health, even if you have health insurance, the fact that other people don't directly impacts you. So those are my top 3 priorities. I would fight tooth and nail, and in the short term, it has to be, I think, an iterative process. Look, I'm under no illusion that all of these things, these ambitious things, can happen overnight, but we can at least be fighting in the first instance.
Thank you very much. And let me just reiterate the 3 parts of that question, the 3 issues that you would work on, what actions you would take, and what in your background qualifies you to work on those issues. We go now to Allison Fine.
Thank you. So I have been working on how to use technology for social good for the last 15 years. I wrote the first book that had the phrase social media in it in 2005. In order to do that work as a technology futurist, I have had to do a deep dive into how we're structured as a society, what's pulling us apart, and how we come back together again. So my top 3 priorities are to make sure that every worker has a set of universal benefits that stays with them instead of with the job. And we've just seen what happens when people don't have paid sick leave, which every worker needs to have. And we know that unions have been decimated. Everybody needs to have access to a union. We need to have health insurance that stays with people instead of staying with the job. And the next issue in order to rebuild the middle class is that every woman needs to be safe, healthy, and have the opportunity to be prosperous. We need reproductive freedom. I would codify Roe. But we've also just seen what happens when parents don't have access to affordable childcare, and we're sending women back to work right now with schools, camps, and daycare centers closed. I have no idea what we expect those parents to do. And the last thing is to create the Department of Ecological Stewardship from the EPA in order to address the very intersectional issues of the climate crisis.
Thank you for that answer. We will now hear from Evelyn Farkas. And please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay, my 3 issues are addressing the climate crisis, addressing the COVID economic crisis, really the depression, and then third, healthcare. Although I'm adding a 4th, which is addressing the real threat to our democracy and our economic security posed by Donald Trump. Because I'm not sure whether when we get to Congress, he'll still be there or not. And if he is, then we need to address that as well. What am I going to do? On the climate crisis, we need to implement a Green New Deal. And interestingly enough, that's the same thing that I intend to do to address the new depression, the COVID economic depression we're in part. We need to reform our tax structure so that the very wealthy are paying their fair share. We need to take away the subsidies that the fossil fuel companies have been getting, and take those subsidies and take the tax revenue and put it into green new infrastructure, renewable energy subsidies and incentives. And then we need to create an affordable, accessible healthcare for all, which means creating a public option. These things, all these things I will achieve, including standing up to Donald Trump and his attempts to create an autocracy in America, create fascism in America, and further erode the economic basis of our lives and create greater division economically and politically and racially. How will I do this? I've already stood up to Donald Trump. I'm on the record doing it repeatedly, even in this campaign. How will I achieve the other things? I have already served as a senior staffer in Congress, in the Senate, for 7 years on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I know how to draft and pass legislation at the federal level.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Asha Castleberry Hernandez.
Well, my top priority is definitely to make sure that we address economic instability. Right now, we're experiencing that as a result of COVID. And prior to that, most of us were experiencing economic instability. The local economy was not working for all of us. So we could see that, the conditions are most likely going to exacerbate. So it's very important that we continue to provide more assistance, especially to those that from the most vulnerable most vulnerable communities are able to bounce back and be able to work in the economy or be able to just live through this local economy. So that's very important. Be able to stabilize the housing sector. That's very important. Be able to, recommend funding more towards HUD so we can help strengthen the affordable housing, and also, continuously restore the SALT deduction. Addressing the student loan debt issue. That's a very important issue too as well when it comes to economic stability. So why do I have experience that? Absolutely, this is personal to me. I've been hit hard with the student loan debt as well, and I know what it is to be attacked by when it comes to interest rates, and it's just an ugly issue, and we need to really address this. Also, my second priority is the health issue. Of course, many of you guys know that I have recently lost my grandfather as a result of COVID. So it's very important to me that we support a pathway to Medicare for all. I will be a fighter to ensure that we stabilize that pathway, try to generate the funding that is needed to pay for Medicare for all, and make sure that everyone has access to affordable health care, especially in Congressional District 17. And last but not least, the environment, supporting a Green New Deal.
Thank you. Now we hear from David Carlucci.
So I believe that the three top things: we have to fight and eliminate poverty, and we also have to end the scourge of gun violence in this country, and we have to fight hate and racism that's pervasive in our country that we see pouring out more than ever before. So the first thing, fighting poverty, how do we do that? We have to reform the tax code and give the privileges that have been only afforded to the rich. We have to make that accessible to everyone. We have to reform our healthcare system to make sure that everyone has access to healthcare. The leading cause of bankruptcy in this country is medical debt. We have to make sure that our education system, that we have universal pre-K and early education to make sure that our children have the bright future and can succeed in whatever they want to do. And we have to invest in fighting climate change, in passing the Green New Deal, putting people to work. That will help to reduce poverty, and I hope one day eliminate poverty in this nation and be an example for the rest of the world. We have to end the scourge of gun violence in this nation. And I've been proud to be a co-sponsor of many different pieces of legislation to end the scourge of gun violence in New York State. And I'm hopeful that that will be a national model to follow. And the last part that I talked about is ending hate and racism in this country. One of the pieces of legislation that I support on the state level as well as the federal level is to be proactive, to get to our children age-appropriate curriculum to learn about symbols of hate.
Thank you very much. Our next answer is from David Buchwald.
Thank you, John. I think one of the top issues that we're going to be facing in the next Congress is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic's implications. Might not just be economic. We could be in the middle of a second wave. But whether it's on the health or economic fronts, I believe that we need to be taking decisive action. We should have paid sick leave, as I'm proud we've adopted here in New York. I was a co-sponsor of New York's COVID-19 paid sick leave bill. But we also need to be rebuilding the economy, investing in infrastructure, and restoring the SALT deduction. I was a tax attorney before I was a state assembly member, and I've already been fighting as a representative of 132,000 residents of Westchester to deal with that, not least because Rockland and Westchester are the largest property tax residents of the entire country. Secondly, we need to absolutely deal with the fact that Donald Trump has torn our institutions of our country apart. He's been a divisive leader, and some basic norms that have been established over centuries have been rent asunder by his failed leadership. And so the next Congress, even if he is no longer president, will have a great task of repairing those institutions, the independence judiciary, and the Justice Department among them. Lastly, gun safety. As co-sponsor of New York's SAFE Act, I absolutely believe that we need to deal with that issue at the federal level. I, of course, took on Donald Trump by working to expose his tax returns. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Adam Schleifer.
Thanks, John. So we already dealt in the first question with the problem of the unredeemed promises of our Constitution. So bracketing that and talking about three other critical issues, I would start with recovering from, as a public health matter, the coronavirus, and then to the economic devastation, by the way, which I believe, unfortunately, folks, will get worse before it gets better. So as to that first issue, I would say we need to learn from the mistakes. We need to learn what happens when we don't have data-driven, scientifically led governance that is not empirical, that is not based in facts. That's what Donald Trump has given us, and we see the consequences. So we need to learn from that. We need to restore our medical preparedness and our strategic resources when it comes to pandemic attacks, and we need to be continuing to stimulate the economy. 80% of America can't miss a number of paychecks in a row. 70% of our economy is consumer driven. We need massive stimulation, and we need to put more cash in people's pockets and condition aid to corporations on the agreement that they do not buy back shares, issue dividends, or let go of their workers at this critical time. Number two, climate change. If we cannot give if our children, our children's children cannot inherit a healthy, habitable planet, there is nothing else that really matters. I took on this issue as a federal prosecutor fighting a conspiracy to violate the Clean Air Act, and I understand that we need to do that. And thirdly, it looks like I'm running a little low on time. The gun violence issue. We need common sense gun reform. I was a near victim of this in first grade in New York City public schools, and I took dozens and dozens of dangerous high-capacity handguns and weapons off the streets as a prosecutor, and I'm prepared to protect our children and our teachers in Congress.
Thank you. Our next question is one that some of you might have obliquely already referenced, but an opportunity now to dig down a little deeper, and we'll pose this to Allison Fine. It deals with income inequality. In the last 20 years, by one statistic, U.S. gross domestic product has risen 79%, with the income of the bottom half of earners rising only 20%, while the very wealthy had a 420% increase. The median wealth of white households is now 10 times higher by one metric than that of African-American households. So the question is, what specific legislation would you support or introduce to remedy income inequality?
Thank you for this incredibly important question. I just saw today that we are at a level of inequality in regards to income that we have not seen since 1968, which I think is very interesting given all the other parallels. The first thing is we need to reform our tax code. We need to repeal the tax effort of 2017. And we need to increase the taxes at the higher income levels. The second thing is that we need to support union organizing, because it is the loss of union jobs. It used to be that 30% of jobs were union, now fewer than 10% are union, is a way to increase wages and provide better benefits for workers. The next thing, as I mentioned before, is that all workers need to have benefits, and we need to decrease the burden of student loans on young people, so that they can become entrepreneurs. Not many people know that we were at a 30-year low for business startups right before this crisis. Many of the small businesses that have gone dark right now won't come back because the PPP money went out through the commercial banks, which discriminated against small business, instead of going out through the payroll companies. and keeping businesses afloat and people employed. So we need to have a great big burst of energy and creativity and entrepreneurship by making more capital available to people. Thank you.
Thank you. We now hear from Evelyn Farkas. And Evelyn, please unmute your mic.
Thank you. Well, we have really grave income disparities, as you mentioned, John. And this is deeply troubling and, as we see, unhealthy for our democracy. It's a product of bad tax policy over the course of years, but also systemic racism, as we've already touched upon here and there. On the tax policy front, we clearly need tax reform. We need to establish tax rates at higher tax rates, so higher tax brackets. Above 1 million, 5 million, and 10 million, the marginal rates should be adjusted for very wealthy individuals. Then those tax resources can be used to create a public health option, to funnel money into 12 through K education, which I believe is a place where we need to urgently start to equalize, because we do not have equality in terms of the quality of public school education offered to children. It's still based on the tax base that they have. So the federal government needs to step into the breach there and do more in terms of setting standards and funding. In addition to that, we need to make sure that we address with the housing reform that I believe that I touched upon already, but we need to increase funding to HUD. It's at 1/3 the level that it was in the 70s. And the increased funding should also be in part used, targeted towards those communities that have been negatively affected by redlining. So historically disadvantaged African-American families. And I'll stop there.
I thank you. And now I have to unmute my mic. Our next answer is from Asha Castleberry Hernandez.
Thank you for the question. You know, I come from a generation where we did not have generational wealth. You know, that's what makes me pretty distinctive compared to many of my opponents. And unfortunately, now we're dealing with conditions where income inequality exacerbates wealth inequality in this country. So it's very important that we do support legislation like reparations for African Americans, which was orchestrated by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. I think that's great that we have normalized that discussion, because prior to that, it wasn't, due to just a series of laws that have prevented people from talking about this issue. But also we have to look at it in a more broader sense. We have to look at, you know, investing in economic literacy programs that would most likely be pushed by the state, but can receive guidance from the federal level to ensure that economic literacy programs exist, and especially in the most vulnerable communities. Also looking at creating more small businesses, especially from those that come from low middle income communities, and you know, be able to provide a perspective of where they think the living wage should be in this district. And not only that, support a living wage, as I've mentioned before. Looking at it right now, supporting $15 on a federal level. By the time we pass that, it's not going to be enough in terms of keeping up with building wealth or living in Congressional District 17. And last but not least, we need to also eradicate the student loan debt. That is so important. That is what's hurting us right now, especially for the younger generation who wants to build on their wealth. And then when they face a wage or a salary that doesn't pay enough, it's hard for them to build on their wealth and live the American dream. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we hear from David Carlucci.
Thank you. I believe we need to raise taxes on the wealthiest, and we need to lower taxes on low-income families and individuals. We have to make sure that housing is a right in this country. That's why I voted for the expansion of the Emergency Tenant Protection Act here in New York State. And we need to reform and revamp the Community Reinvestment Act, which was written almost 50 years ago. And now with internet lending and all of that, we need to make sure that we have safeguards in place and we help the 30 million Americans that are unbanked become banked. We need to have financial literacy standard across the United States to teach children and even adults how to avoid debt and how to build a business and follow that American dream. And then we need to revamp and reimagine on a federal level the Minority and Women Business Enterprise Program. We've done much work in New York State, and we need to do that on the federal level. And this is something that we know we can do, but all of these issues have to be tackled. I think one of the biggest factors in this, when we talk about affordability, and like we said before, one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States is medical debt. So every American needs access to quality healthcare, and they need access to quality housing as well. And that will make a tremendous difference and a big impact for our future.
Thank you. And now we hear from David Buchwald.
Addressing income inequality starts, but it only starts with raising the federal minimum wage, which shamelessly is still at $7.25 an hour, same rate as when I defeated my Republican predecessor in the state assembly, and in part on a platform of raising the minimum wage here in New York. And indeed, now we're on our way to $15 an hour. And frankly, it should be indexed across our country to increase over time based on inflation. We also need to have a much fairer tax code to address income inequality. Yes, repealing the 2017 Trump Republican tax bill, making sure that we have multimillionaires tax brackets, but also ending the current tax preference for capital gains over ordinary income, the working men and women's income tax bracket. So I really believe that there are a host of things we can do, but it also begins with recognizing the fundamental rights of Americans to form a union and to collectively bargain. That's why I support legislation like the PRO Act that's already introduced in Congress. And I will simply say that I've been someone who's been proud to be endorsed by unions like the New York State Nurses Union, Communications Workers of America, and 32BJ and others. I wonder, since he's talking next, Mr. Schleifer, last time before you were a congressional candidate that you walked the picket line. I wonder when that was.
All right. Thank you for that answer. And our next answer is from Adam Schleifer.
Well, implicit in your question, David, is the deep need for congratulations. So I will congratulate you on walking the picket line. And then what I'll tell you is I would ask you, when is the last time you've taken payday lenders off the backs of hardworking New Yorkers, as I have, when I took down the payday lending industry and lead generation payday lending industry in New York that Mr. Carlucci takes contributions from, and you've done nothing to address? Or the unfair predatory subprime auto lenders that I put into receivership in this state when they were taking advantage of hardworking borrowers. So I very much understand the need to make economic justice a reality for people. And in fact, I've devoted my career to doing so, not only as a consumer protection regulator for Governor Cuomo, but also as a federal prosecutor, where I was in the major frauds unit, taking on securities frauds and scams that victimized immigrants, members of churches, and members of synagogues. So I've done my part, and I thank you for doing yours. Now, I would say we do need to reform the tax code. We need to have a new tax bracket at $1 million at 40%, another one at $2 million at 42%. We need to cap capital gains treatment so that folks like Warren Buffett, as he says, don't have a lower effective tax rate than his employees who make far lower in income. We need to address the housing issue. We need tax incentives that support private building for middle class and low income folks, and we need it throughout our district. Too often in our district, I'm going to say a hard truth. We have people who say they love the idea of affordable housing and mixed, diverse communities and mixed income communities, but just in somebody else's town. And I'm here to say, unfortunately, for those who don't understand it, you need to understand if you like mixed income and affordable housing, you like it in your neighborhood too. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. And now Mondaire Jones.
Thank you for the question. This is personal for me. I mean, I grew up in Section 8 housing and on food stamps, and my young single mom still had to work multiple jobs just to put food on the table for us. So things like a $15 minimum wage are absolutely necessary at the federal level. I know that to be true firsthand. I'm the only candidate in this race running on the platform that we need to do a wealth tax in this country. I support Elizabeth Warren's proposal, 2% on 2 cents on every dollar in excess of $50 million in wealth, 3 cents on every dollar in excess of $1 billion. If Michael Bloomberg can spend over $1 billion on a presidential campaign, I think he can afford to pay a little bit more in taxes so that we can fund essential government services and ensure that everyone lives in dignity in our society. Of course, we also need to raise the marginal rate on our highest income earners. I absolutely agree with that. They're much lower today than they were even under Ronald Reagan when he took office in 1981. But we have to also take a look at why people are going bankrupt or not having money to even save right now. And that is because of structural inequality in our country. It's why I support Medicare for all, so that people don't have to worry about economics when they think about how to get necessary medical care. It's why I support housing as a right. And frankly, I was disappointed that Assemblyman Buchwald voted against critical protections for tenants in the housing space last year. And thank God for Democrats who voted to pass that legislation anyway. But you don't get to revise history as you do on 50A, for example, to use another example. It's important to look at people's legislative record as they tout their years of experience in Albany in this race. It's so important. And it's not just the IDC situation with David Carlucci, it's also the fact that people need to show leadership before it becomes politically palatable. And so those are some of the things that I've been thinking about, structural changes in addition to reforming our tax code to make sure that everybody can live the American dream in this country.
Thank you for that question. Our next question is posed first to Evelyn Farkas. It deals with education. The federal government provides only limited funding for public education, averaging 8% of school budgets nationwide, an average which has dropped over the years. States and local school communities have to provide the rest, which causes unequal funding of public schools across the country. The question is, how much increased federal spending for education do you recommend, and how would you direct it through federal legislation? And I also ask you to please unmute your mic.
Thank you very much. So your question is phenomenal and pretty much states a case that I agree with. We have ridiculously underfunded the education of our children, and that is a national shame. So we absolutely must increase the amount of federal funding that we put into education. Now, to give you a number today would be irresponsible. I can't do that. In a separate debate today, Mr. Schleifer said that I knew nothing. He said that he was the only one who knew something about budgets and about spreadsheets. I've worked in Congress, as I said, for 7 years at a very senior level, authorizing budgets of billions of dollars, looking at lots of spreadsheets. And so I won't give you a figure. But what I can tell you is that we need to put more money into early childhood education, into after-school programs. We need to pay teachers better. We need to put a nurse and a therapist in every school. Then at the federal level, we need to raise the standards, because too often we know in our district, specifically in Rockland, we have arguments about funding based on standards. And the standards, quite frankly, are set too low, so people can use the standards as an excuse to not fund appropriately. So we at the federal level need to step in and raise the standards, but then we also need to help the communities by providing increased funding. So listen, the access to equal opportunity, the access to equal rights to achieving the American dream starts with K through 12 education. There's more we need to do on education beyond that. I think I already talked about funding for community colleges for lifelong learning. I can do that later. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Our next answer now comes from Asha Castleberry Hernandez.
Yes, thank you for that question. First and foremost, as far as looking at the budget itself, of course, increase it to help, support many programs within the education sector. But first and foremost, we need to get someone like Betsy DeVos out running the Department of Education. I think that has been, poison to us under this administration and has been extremely terrible for many of us. So that's first and foremost. And again, also, I do support more funding towards K through 12. I think that's very important as far as a stepping stone. And also, too, I would continue doing what we see, Nita Lowy has been doing in terms of supporting STEM, increasing funding towards STEM programs like science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So we can also not only, get more funding in that sector, but be able to create equitable opportunities in our district so everybody has an equal chance to be part of a STEM program. Also, I recently published an article with supporting the idea of Anthony Brown, who mentioned that, Congressman Anthony Brown, who mentioned that we can use our defense money along with education budget to create pipelines for young people that are coming out of minority institutions to be able to work into the federal agencies like DOD or Department of Defense or Department of health services to work on you work in jobs in STEM. So I think that we need a direct pipeline, to connect that from education to jobs. So we definitely need to utilize our money in those type of building those type of pathway career programs. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. And next is David Carlucci.
Thank you. Education has got to be a top priority. Look, right here in Rockland and Westchester counties, we pay the highest property taxes in the nation. And we have to stop the practice of pitting property taxpayers against school children. It has to stop. We need the federal government to invest in Title I funding, to invest in the IDEA Act, the Individuals with Disability Education Act. It's a disgrace that property taxpayers, states, and localities have to pick up the tab. And we know just here in New York State, it depends on where you live in terms of the quality education that you get. That has to change. And the only way we're going to be able to change it is with a partner in the federal government. So I believe that if we can give bailouts to the banks, if we can give bailouts to automobile manufacturers and give subsidies to pharmaceutical companies, which have made people like Adam Schleifer filthy rich and be able to try to buy this race, then we certainly can invest in our education system. And that's going to be a top priority for me. We have to start with our underfunded schools where there's children of poverty. We have to make sure that universal Head Start, we have to have that. That's critical. I chair the Mental Health Committee in the New York State Senate. And I know that if we do not get to our children early, we pay the price later on. And it's a price that we can now no longer afford to pay. We have to invest early, and we have to make sure that all of our children get the education that they deserve.
Thank you. Now, David Buchwald.
I'm very proud to be a graduate of Westchester Public Schools K through 12. Even prouder to be a parent of two young girls, the oldest of which next year will be starting kindergarten here in the White Plains Public Schools. Our federal government does need to step up. Frankly, it should start even before kindergarten. Pre-K programs, I think, are very deserving of an investment. We've learned in our country that's somewhere the biggest inequality in education comes is the preparation before public school even starts in many places. In traditional primary secondary schools, I certainly agree that the federal government has not been fulfilling its responsibilities under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The federal government is supposed to be providing 40% of funding, but it's woefully short of that. And then going into higher education, we should making sure that the federal government allows every American to attend community colleges or historically Black colleges and universities and other institutions that serve those who often are most in need of a leg up. And I absolutely believe that is the best way to work towards that dual track need of investing in education, but also making sure that we address long-term those income inequality issues that we were talking about earlier.
All right, thank you very much. Our next answer is from Adam Schleifer.
John, would you mind quickly repeating the question? It's hard to keep track with all the cheap shots.
Surely, the federal government provides only limited funding for public education, averaging 8% of school budgets nationwide. That average has dropped over the years. States and local school communities have to provide the rest, which causes unequal funding of public schools across the country. How much increased federal spending for education do you recommend, and how would you direct it through federal legislation?
Yes, so it's a great question. We need to ensure from the federal government that every child, no matter where they are fortunate or unfortunate enough to be born and raised, has an adequate public education available to them. I am so glad that I was able to go to public school, both in New York City and in Westchester County, and graduate from the public school system and get a great education that needs to be guaranteed for every person in this country. And so the federal government needs to come in and create a floor above which cities and localities and towns should be able to adjust as they like. So in other words, we need an adequate floor, and then each area should be free to say, we want a certain tax raise from our communities that we self-assess, and that permits people to essentially vote with their feet in what they call communitarian democracy, so that folks can choose which town they live in, but no child should be forced to have a public education that's inadequate. I would fund these things through raising the taxes, as I said, in my tax plan, which is more progressive even than hopefully future President Joe Biden's, but also through other initiatives, including the carbon tax that I favor. And I would ensure that we have a universal pre-K so that we start this early, so that we reach children early in intervention, because that is so critical. And so we need to be doing a better job of allowing the federal government to help our local partners in government and ensure that every child has a fair opportunity. And finally, I'm proud to say I took on fraud and abuse in the student loan industry as a federal prosecutor. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next answer is from Mondaire Jones.
Educational equity is a huge priority of mine, because I would not be able to run for United States Congress right now had what was at the time a quality public education in the East Ramapo Central School District not allow me to transcend my humble beginnings and make it to some great institutions, and now more recently, hopefully in the halls of Congress. This is something that has persisted for as long as we have funded our public schools through a property tax-based system. We have to change that. That is the only way we're going to get true equity in education. And we have to get buy-in from people who may want to poll test things before they come out to take a position on it. So we have to make sure we have real leadership in the Democratic Party on that. I have been supporting an increase in Title I funding for our most impoverished institutions. And that's separate and apart from my work as a private citizen, calling for more foundation aid and being an activist for more foundation aid, for example, in 2019, for example, for not just East Ramapo, but North Rockland and Rockland County. And we know that foundation aid continues to be an issue in Ossining and Port Chester and Peekskill, my goodness. So we have to increase the funding at the federal level, not just the state. It also has to be the federal government marshaling its resources to fully fund our public schools. Of course, fully funding the IDEA, which is grossly underfunded. It is a promise unfulfilled, as any instructor will tell you, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. There's also Title IV of the Education Code, which is for technology. We need to make sure that people who are expected to do distance learning right now actually have laptops and desktops at home. I had to work with private philanthropists to get laptops in Ramapo High School, for example, when that became an issue recently. So we have to make sure that we are stepping up as a federal government and being a good partner to the states and the local school districts.
Thank you for that answer. Sorry to step on you there. And our next answer is from Allison Fine.
Thank you. Several years ago, I worked on a project in a public school in Harlem. And in one building, there was both a public school and a charter school. And the inequality of resources in that one place where the children could see the difference of what they weren't getting in the charter school was morally reprehensible. Every strong democracy in the world has a strong public school system. We need to invest in technology internally in the schools and technology for the children to have at home. We see what's happening now with children being forced to learn at home and not having adequate technology. And broadband internet needs to be a right of every person in this country. The federal government needs to be funding support for the upkeep of structures, and actual buildings, and supplies for teachers. We have a country where we have public school teachers going on Donors Choose to beg for supplies in the richest country in the world. That is outrageous. And most of all, we need the federal government to take the lead in building curricula to help us pivot from how to learn, pivot from what to learn to how to learn. Content is available everywhere, but we need kids to know the difference between truth and lies, and we need them to be able to create new solutions for the problems that are ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question deals with the subject of democracy, and we pose it to Asha Castleberry Hernandez first. The balance of power in our democracy has been shifting to increased presidential power and diminished congressional power in recent years. What measures would you propose to strengthen and enforce the power of Congress?
Thank you so much. This question is definitely personal to me because I have spent my, my life, sacrificing my life to protect our democracy. So I believe that United States always should be the model in terms of a strong democracy worldwide. First and foremost, I do believe that more power has tilted more towards the presidency of the executive office, especially post-Nixon administration, where you've seen, that those powers pretty much expand over time. So I believe that we should continue more congressional oversight, especially when it comes to domestic and foreign policy. As a person who has both domestic and foreign policy experience, it's very important when you're seeking a federal position, because you have to be able to fairly evaluate or assess the executive office in terms of decision making, because there's a lot of discretion going on there that's been given by the Constitution, especially when it comes to foreign policy. When you look at trade, when you look at the presidency, when it comes to make a decision under these wars that are going on right now. We need to make sure that we send someone to Washington that understands the decision making coming out of the executive office and how you can implement congressional oversight on these powers. So it's very important, and it's really important when it comes to our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next answer is from David Carlucci.
Thank you. There's no question about our current president, Donald Trump. Now I'm just not surprised by what I see every day. Something just a few years ago would just be unimaginable. Whether it's bringing in the military to put down protests or international affairs. We need to have congressional oversight, and this president has proven that to be the case. So we need to strengthen those powers and make it clear what the president can do and not do. One of the biggest problems we've seen is the issue of transparency and knowing exactly what is going on and what type of influences that the president is pushing. This president has pushed it to the limit, and I'm hopeful that this will give us, the silver lining will be that we can enact laws that will help protect us and give more power to Congress to make sure that our president doesn't act in a way that jeopardizes us. We have to outline and clearly define, and I believe update, what it means for a declaration of war. We've seen that, and that debate has gone on for a long time. But now with this president, it's a very scary proposition and something that needs to be updated and brought into the 21st century.
Thank you. David Buchwald.
As a legislator at two levels of government, first in the White Plains Common Council and now in the state legislature, I've constantly believed in holding chief executives and administrations to account. And of course, as a state assembly member, I sponsored the bill to hold Donald Trump to account by allowing the turnover of his New York State tax returns to Congress, a law that Donald Trump himself is suing to stop right now in the courts. But in Congress, and hopefully with a new president, in any case, I still believe that we need to make sure that the institutions of government that are there to check the president are as vital as possible. It does indeed mean strong congressional oversight. It also means truly independent inspector generals in the federal executive branch agencies. It means respecting science and not shelving either scientists of the EPA when they disagree with the president over climate change, or scientists of the CDC when they're trying to keep us safe. I also believe that we absolutely need to strengthen the public records access laws in our country. I've been a champion of the Freedom of Information law here in New York State, and there are federal improvements we should be making as well. And lastly, we need to make sure that if Congress is to have more authority, we need to have a Congress that people respect. That's why we need to do things like End Citizens United and end the practice of partisan gerrymandering in our country, so that people can look to the Congress and realize it really is the branch that most represents the people.
Thank you for your answer. Adam Schleifer is next.
Yeah, about 20 years ago, I read a book, John, in college called The Abdication of the Congressional Power and War and Spending by Lewis Fisher. And I was struck then at just how far Congress had abdicated its responsibilities. And this was, of course, before or right around the time of 9/11. And we've seen further erosion of the congressional prerogative since that time. This is something that's familiar to me because I taught constitutional law and I understand the way our government is supposed to function and how far we are from that. One of the things we need to do, I thank David for mentioning the issue of inspectors general. What we need to do to fix that problem is to make clear through a law that our inspectors generals are principal officers under our Constitution and under the precedents concerning the removal power, and then ensure through a statute that all inspectors general are removable only for good cause, not for just the way it is now, where the president essentially has an at-will relationship and needs only to declare that he has no confidence, not why. So we need a set of limitations on the executive that works, as they say, for all seasons, that avoids the bogging down that we saw Ken Starr do in the mid-90s, but also reins in monsters like President Trump. And one of the best ways to do that is to ensure that all inspectors general have to be terminated only for good cause. Another thing, as David mentioned, is gerrymandering. Congress under Article 1, Section 4 actually has the power to draw election districts. We should take that power from the crooked legislatures in places like North Carolina that have done things with the help of the abdicating Supreme Court, and take that power back for Congress and draw districts that are fair and representative and make real democracy in this country. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Mondaire Jones is next.
Yeah, John, I think I know that the question wasn't just about international, it was domestic too, right? Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Surely. The balance of power in our democracy has been shifting to increased presidential power and diminished congressional power in recent years. What measures would you propose to strengthen and enforce the powers of Congress?
Sure. You know, the powers of Congress are defined in Article 1 of the Constitution. The framers thought that Congress actually should be more powerful than the executive branch. That's why they describe the powers of Congress in Article 1. And we have absolutely seen the diminishment of Congress's powers. One of those powers is the power of the purse. I mean, we can be withholding support for any number of programs. You know, Ro Khanna, for example, who endorsed my campaign recently, was pushing for an amendment as Donald Trump was attempting to go to war with Iran that would literally defund his ability to do so. That's the kind of energy that we ought to be bringing to the fight against Donald Trump or any other president who would be adverse to the interests of the American people. We can do this also through oversight. I mean, there's a number of committees that have oversight authority over a variety of government agencies in the executive branch, and we need people who are going to be willing to hold Donald Trump's or anyone else's nominees accountable in that regard. But more than that, as we think about authorization for the use of military force, I support legislation that would require a president to periodically return to Congress to get a renewal of that authority. The fact that Donald Trump was thinking about going to war with Iran in reliance on a 2002 authorization of the use of military force is unconscionable. And frankly, I didn't agree with Barack Obama when he tried to do the same thing in another matter. And so we have to make sure that we are holding any executive, whether a Democrat or Republican, accountable when it comes to military intervention.
Thank you. Our next answer comes from Allison Fine.
Thank you. We have a need for a fully functioning progressive Congress more than ever, not just because of the usurpation of power by the executive branch over the last 40 years, but because we have a right-wing Supreme Court, and we will seemingly for a while. We need a Congress that is transparent and that works the way the country works now. It has been astonishing to me to watch a Congress that has refused to work remotely. The House has just recently moved to be able to do some work remotely, but it is so antiquated in how it operates. It needs to modernize its all of its infrastructure and processes. More importantly, though, we need congressional electeds who are accountable, who won't take PAC money. I won't take any corporate PAC money, and who will abide by the rules of transparency set out by a group called the Sunlight Foundation. And I was on the board of the Sunlight Foundation. And one of the issues that's very important is requiring members of Congress to open up their calendars, to see who they're meeting with, to see who has their ears. So we need to do all of those things. And I would also say we should not be celebrating the fact that that women make up 23% of Congress right now. And when you see the governments around the world that function the best, women are a large part of those bodies.
Thank you for that answer. We now hear from Evelyn Farkas. And unmute your mic, please.
Well, my colleagues know what I'm going to say. I worked a decade in the legislative branch and a decade in the executive branch. I know the difference between the two. I know what the authorities are, and I know that Congress is preeminent. When I worked in the executive branch, I advised President Obama. We were in the White House Situation Room. We had to factor in the authority under Article 1 of the United States Congress and the power of the purse. When I worked on the Hill in the 2000, so I'm 52, for 10 years I went overseas. I got graduate school education, and then came the 20 years in the federal government, and 1 year in New York here, Council of Foreign Relations. The experience that I got though in the legislative branch was key. And the problem is that the executive branch has eroded and usurped the authority of the congressional branch with alarming pace. It was already happening when I was up there under the Bush administration, and we were trying to hold the line. Myself and my boss at the time, Senator Carl Levin, who's endorsed me, along with Secretary Kerry and about a dozen sitting members of Congress, he and we opposed the Iraq War. We believed that it was unlawful because there was no imminent threat coming from Iraq, from Saddam Hussein. Nevertheless, of course, the executive branch did what it did, but Congress, unfortunately, has been eroded further under this president, under President Trump. And it has become critical because we saw with the impeachment hearings that Congress was really hanging on by a thread in terms of its enforcement authority. And we see that on the border as well.
Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question will be addressed first to David Carlucci, and it deals with foreign policy. What congressional powers would you exert to deal with the deterioration of the nation's strategic alliances and the prospects for peace in the Middle East?
So I think there's a lot we have to do internationally. Unfortunately, this president has really, I think, disgraced the United States, starting with the withdrawal from the Paris Accord. But I think that we need to have focus on peace in the Middle East. We have to make sure that Iran does not have the ability to make any weapons of mass destruction, obviously including nuclear weapons, but any weapons of mass destruction. And that really needs to be our focus. We need to be a strong supporter of Israel and provide the funding like we've always done without restrictions, without putting qualifications in front of that aid. We've seen the success of Iron Dome, and we've seen the success of those policies in protecting our greatest ally in the Middle East, which is Israel. So I believe that when we talk about the Middle East, one of the top priorities has to be watching very carefully what's going on in Iran and doing whatever we can to prevent them from being able to enrich uranium and being able to develop nuclear weapons. That would be something of a disaster for all of us.
Thank you. We now hear from David Buchwald.
Thank you, John. And it's interesting to me that the two questions, the current one, last one, actually really intertwine, because we just saw last month Donald Trump unilaterally withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty. That's not just a treaty between us and Russia, but many of our allies in Europe, for example, are parties to it. And the fact that Congress over time sort of assumed that we would have a rational, disciplined president, obviously that assumption can no longer hold. And so we do need to make sure that Congress plays more of a role when it comes to not allowing the chief executive unfettered power when it comes to foreign policy. And that's especially true when it comes to standing with our allies, whether it's our NATO allies, what the president continuously tries to denigrate, or standing with allies like I think our strong relationship with Israel. But it is also important that with friends, you tell them the truth. And I think right now, one of the roles the United States can and should be playing is conveying that it's important to preserve a opportunity for a two-state solution. And that's obviously under threat right now. And the United States should be conveying that Israel should not be taking unilateral actions that undermine that basic principle in believing in two states or two peoples.
Thank you for that answer. Next, we hear from Adam Schleifer.
Yeah, so as a starting point, we all work better when we work together. It's a basic principle. Our president has forsaken it, whether it's the Paris Accords or his withdrawal from WHO or his absolute insistence in a very wrong-headed and dangerous fashion in making bilateral relations that are supposed to reflect comedy and pragmatism over time that transcend individual leaders, instead a function of strange personality plays that he engages in. What do I mean by that? We should not have the relationships between the UK and the United States, Israel and the United States, Germany and the United States, and France and the United States devolve into questions about whose handshake is stronger or who insulted whom off a hot mic on a dais. These are important, durable, strategic relationships that need to transcend individuals and administrations. And the more quickly we can understand that and remove the greatest threat to our national security, the president of our country right now, Donald Trump, the better off we'll be. As to the Middle East, we need to, again, this is a great example. Actually, let me start with North Korea. So his politics of personality have endangered us by allowing Kim Jong-un to get one over on us many times. And we are closer to a nuclear breakaway threat in North Korea than we ever were before. And we need to absolutely ensure that that maniacal dictator who has imprisoned so many of his own people is not allowed to do that. We need to contain China. We need to stand up strong and say you cannot imprison 1 million of your own people on the basis of their Muslim ethnic. And we need to ensure, of course, at all costs that Iran does not destabilize the entire Middle East by getting the breakaway nuclear capability. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. We now hear from Mondaire Jones.
I'm sure many of my colleagues have been horrified by the unraveling of our strategic relationships with any number of countries who have natural symmetry with our interests. These are long-standing relationships that Donald Trump has eviscerated overnight because of many of the petty reasons that you just heard described by another candidate. And so we have to make sure that we get a president who actually cares about those relationships. But if for some godforsaken reason we don't, we have to make sure that Congress is exerting its power. And so again, I come back to things that it can actually leverage to make this president act a certain way in the international space. That has to be financial incentives and disincentives, not approving budgets unless they do right by our allies, and also making sure that we are exerting oversight over the State Department and the Defense Department. And by the way, we need to be funding the State Department at a much higher rate than we are currently doing. We have seen the vast diminishment of the State Department's budget over the past several decades. Ronan Farrow wrote a book about it, my goodness, and many people have made the same observation. As our defense budget has ballooned, the lasting peace and security that we need and that I hope for internationally is best achieved through diplomacy, not military intervention. And of course, we have to make sure that we are re-entering so many different agreements, the Paris Climate Agreement. I also support the Iran nuclear deal. I think that we've seen that now that we've withdrawn from it, Iran has resumed its dangerous nuclear weapons program. So we have to get back into that. Of course, we can fight to make it better too. It was not a perfect deal. I acknowledge that. But those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. And of course, we need to make sure that we get a two-state solution. I agree with Assemblyman Buchwald with respect to Israel.
Thank you very much for that answer. And we now hear from Allison Fine.
Thank you. We're in a dreadful position in regards to the absolute horrific relationships that we have with our former and hopefully future allies around the world because of Donald Trump's lack of leadership and his great affection for dictators like Putin. I am heartened by the fact, though, that President Obama was able to remake our relationships with the world when he became president. So we know that this is possible, and we know the world wants it. So we need the U.S. to remake our alliances, strengthen our alliances around the world. We need to once again become the leader for addressing the climate crisis. And although Trump is intending to withdraw from Paris, the Paris Accord hasn't actually happened yet, and so we can still save that. We also need to become the worldwide leader in humanitarian aid as well, and to help reduce the refugee crisis. And we need to invest in girls' education and women's entrepreneurship around the world. Now, Israel is very personal for me. I am past president of Temple Beth Abraham here in Tarrytown. I've been on the leadership committee of the UJA here in Westchester. I'm a firm believer in a two-state solution. The U.S. needs to take the lead to get both parties at the table. And we need to make sure that Iran never, ever becomes a nuclear power.
Thank you for that answer. And we now hear from Evelyn Farkas. And Evelyn.
I did it before you said it.
Okay.
So clearly, I mean, one of the reasons I'm in this race is, frankly, this is not a normal moment in our history. And so we need all hands on deck, and we need people who understand global crises, who have experience managing them both in Congress and, as I said, in the executive branch, all the way to the White House Situation Room. And so I am deeply disturbed about how much this president has put us at great international risk even before the corona crisis. I have traveled to North Korea and discussed with the North Koreans their nuclear weapons program, and it's worse than when I was there in 2008. We clearly need to do something to address their program, not just the nuclear weapons, and back then it was just a plutonium-based program, but the uranium-based program as well as their missiles. We need to also address clearly Iran's nuclear program, which is going completely unaddressed, not to mention that the arms embargo is hanging on by a thread. We need to ensure the safety and security of Israel by standing firm for a two-state solution. The only way we have a Jewish state and a democratic state, which is in our economic, political, and moral interest, is that we have a two-state solution and the Palestinians have their own state as well. I worked in the office where we developed the qualitative military edge for Israel so that Israel could deter all the bad actors in the neighborhood. That needs to continue. But I will start with the fact that we can't do this alone. We need to lead the international community in helping Israel, in addressing the rogue actors, Iran and North Korea. The United States has a long history doing this. We can do it again under President Biden and with strong congressional leadership that understands the issues.
And thank you for that answer. We now hear from Asha Castleberry Hernandez.
Thank you for this question because it is personal to me. I spent 30 months working on security cooperation in the Middle East, which is building on our strategic alliances, working day after day with our Gulf Cooperation Council allies, as well as Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, to help preserve security, peace and security in the region, and definitely to help the security of Israel. So this is personal to me when I see that we have this administration that erodes those strategic alliances, and we need to make sure when we go into Congress that we help continuously restore those alliances because they're so important, especially when it comes to combat and threats. It's important to our national security as well. And along with that, we need to ensure that we restore our nuclear non-proliferation efforts, look into building a nuclear non-proliferation zone throughout the region to ensure that no one proliferates. We have relinquished that effort or that leadership. And also we need to look into making sure that we are leading as a moral leaders. Unfortunately, we're not seen as from the administration. If you look at how we're working with Israel as well as Saudi Arabia, these countries definitely look to the United States for questions, answers, leadership. And unfortunately, we have not been able to provide that under this administration. So we have to make sure that we restore our leadership on the global stage. This is really personal to me because I spent my life sacrificing my life to ensure that we have a strong leadership on the international stage. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you to all the candidates for your answers. The clock now reads 8:23. We have come to the end of our question and answer period, and it's time now for the closing statements. We are asking the candidates to limit their statement to 1 minute. Again, we will have the stop sign at the end of that 1 minute, plus the 15-second warning. And we will continue in sequence and begin our closing statements with David Buchwald.
Thank you, John. Thank you to everyone for joining this evening and to Indivisible Westchester and the activist groups for putting together this night. Our country is at a crossroads, and here in the Lower Hudson Valley, we voters have a choice as to who should succeed Congresswoman Nita Lowey. I'm a serious policymaker who has taken on Donald Trump and has a record of real progressive successes. I've been taking on this awful president, whether it's going after his tax returns or codifying Roe v. Wade here in New York or banning offshore drilling. It's a record of accomplishment delivering for the people of the Lower Hudson Valley that has earned me the support of many. Today, I was endorsed by Westchester County Executive George Latimer. He joins over 80 unions, elected officials, and others in support of my candidacy. So tonight, I ask you to join them and vote for me, David Buchwald, on June 23rd, or better yet, in advance. Get me more information, go to davidbuchwaldforcongress.com. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Now we will hear from Adam Schleifer.
Thank you, John, and thank you to all at Indivisible, Mariana, and everyone else who's participated. You all formed quickly after the disastrous election of President Trump, and I thank you for seeing the threat early. I will stand up to President Trump and his cronies. I have the skill set as a federal frauds prosecutor. Unfortunately, I'm very sad to say that we need people who understand how to investigate and root out fraud, bullying, and corruption in our Congress right now. And like Adam Schiff, I have that background and that ability to do so and fight for our constitutional system. I'm the only person in this race who has both New York and federal experience, making a real difference for real people, making our markets more fair so that they can be more just and more prosperous, and ensuring that we do redeem the promise of our Constitution that we've seen in just the last few weeks. It remains unredeemed. I will fight for the people of this district to form a better district, a better country, and a better planet. And I'm very much looking forward to working with all of you to get things done next year. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we hear from Mondaire Jones.
I'm so grateful to Indivisible Westchester and the numerous other activist groups who came together to organize this important event. And of course to you, John, for being a fantastic moderator. I think the events of this past week have just re-emphasized the importance of having more people in Congress for whom policy is personal. It can't be just Cory Booker and Kamala Harris standing up. Hakeem Jeffries talking about racial injustice in this country. We need to be showing leadership on that and any number of social justice issues in this country. And we needed to be doing it well before the events of this past week. That is the kind of leadership that I would bring to the office. I have said from the beginning that I am running for Congress because for me, policy is personal, not because somebody told me I'd be a member of Congress when I was growing up, because I come from money that I can throw at an election or anything like that. It's because so many of the existential problems that we have in this country have directly impacted me and the people who I know and who I love. Literally, my civil rights are on the line as I think about one of the cases that the Supreme Court is considering right now. And so that, along with my experiences professionally, as someone who worked in the Obama administration and more recently as a lawyer for Westchester County, litigating and winning the county, some of the county's biggest cases, and serving as a legal advisor to a number of Democratic elected officials, I think well prepares me for this job. And I'm so excited about what's going to happen in the next 19 days with your help. Thank you again, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for your statement. And now we hear from Allison Fine.
Thank you. And thank you to all the organizers of this event. It's not easy to organize an event, especially now when everybody is at a distance. I didn't have a life plan to run for this office, but I am running for it for the same reason that Indivisible exists. Because we looked up after the election of 2016 and said, we're not willing to outsource democracy to anyone else anymore. We need different leadership. We need leadership that's agile and entrepreneurial and creative. I am the person in this race who understands the needs and interests and fears and concerns and aspirations of the people of this district. This is my home. I have lived here almost my entire life, and I've raised 3 children here. I have a track record of creating an entire field, and I have the vision of where we go from here. I would love to serve this community. I would love to work with you so that we can create a shared vision of how we move America forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that closing statement. And now we hear from Evelyn Farkas.
So thank you very much to the Indivisibles. Thank you, John and Mariana, for your work tonight, Mariana's silent work. Look, we are losing Nita Lowey. We are losing a trailblazing woman, a very powerful trailblazing woman. And so we should send the next person, the person to take the baton. We should send the most experienced person we can send. And that person is me. I have already drafted and passed legislation, as I said, at the federal level. I know the processes. I know how it works. I have already managed great crises. And this indeed is a moment where we need all hands on deck, all experienced hands on deck, people who have managed crisis at the highest levels, like I said, in the White House Situation Room, and have the judgment that comes with long years of experience, and can jump in on day one and deliver for this district and stand up to a president that I have frankly stood up to before. There are people from our former presidential nominee, Secretary John Kerry, Secretary Leon Panetta, the Emily's List. I'm not gonna be able to list them all. Multiple organizations, Serve America, and about a dozen sitting members of Congress who have said that I am ready. They believe I am ready and I'm suited to take over the day Nita Lowey leaves Congress. So I hope you will go to evelyn4ny.com and vote for me on election day or beforehand by mail.
Thank you for your closing statement. And we will now hear from Asha Castleberry Hernandez.
Well, you know, when I first came to this race, I came out with a hashtag of #ready to serve, because I am ready to serve. You know, I have extensive experiences when it comes to national security. I've been in it since 9/11. I understand when it comes to crisis management. I've worked with the State Department during the Obama administration, working on peacekeeping efforts. I worked on policy when it comes to global legislation and a multilateral effort. And we need people in these type of environments when it comes to legislation. If you never experienced that before, boy, that will be overwhelming on day one for you. Last but not least, what's so special about me is not only I have this extensive experience when it comes to foreign policy, national security, but also I understand what it means to struggle, what it means to in terms of social injustices that have impacted my family, what it means to not have generational wealth in my family and live day by day when it comes to paycheck to paycheck. I understand those struggles. So when you vote for me or you're gonna elect for me, I'm the person that has broad experiences and understands so many issues going across. And I think that's a treat for this race. So thank you. And again, if you want to support me, my name is Asha Casper Hernandez. Please visit us at www.ashaforcongress.com. Thank you.
And thank you for that statement. And now we hear our final closing statement from David Carlucci.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you, Mariana. I want to thank all the candidates, and particularly thank you to Indivisible Westchester for putting on this debate tonight. Look, I'm the only candidate in this race who's actually worked for Congress. I have federal experience, local experience as a town clerk, learning the ins and outs of local government, and I've served in the Senate for the past 10 years. Last year, I was able to get more legislation on the governor's desk than any lawmaker in the state of New York. And I say that because we do need someone to pick up where Congresswoman Lowey is leaving off. Congresswoman Lowey has been a champion, and we need to build off her legacy. The legislation that I've been dedicated to is providing access to health care, providing access to mental health care, and to provide a resource for survivors of domestic violence. I look forward to building upon that and having that legislation, not just in New York, but every corner of this country. Again, I'm David Carlucci, and I'll be honored to serve you as your Congress member. Thank you.
Thank you for that statement. And I would ask all 7 candidates to unmute your microphones right now. We have come to the end of our program. And thanks to all of the candidates for participating tonight, also to our sponsors, and most of all to their voters for their participation tonight. Stay safe, take care of each other, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.